Welcome to the You Need a Training podcast, hosted by Heart and Solutions, a strength-based counseling agency. We know that the life of a mental health professional can be busy, and finding time to complete those continuing education credit hours can be a challenge. With that in mind, this show is focused on helping mental health providers easily access continuing education credits on a variety of topics. The best part? These trainings, many of which will provide at least one credit hour, can be completed anywhere you listen to your podcasts. Traveling to and from work? Great. Taking a walk? Excellent. Enjoying a quiet moment on the couch? Perfect. No matter where you are, get ready for engaging, thought-provoking conversations that double as CE hours, because we all know you need a training.
Hello, welcome to episode 7 of our You Need a Training podcast. I am Dr. Colleen Grote, the Vice President of Therapy at Heart and Solutions. I myself have a PhD in counselor education and supervision. I'm a licensed mental health counselor here in Iowa and a registered play therapy supervisor. Today, I am once again joined by the president and owner of Heart and Solutions, Dr. Julie Johnson.
Hello, great to be back here on You Need a Training. I always have to say that slowly because I'm so used to saying You Need a Counselor, our sister podcast. We have a great training here for you guys today. We've got a returning guest here to give us part 2 of understanding mental health and human behavior through a polyvagal-informed and language-oriented lens. And I feel like since episode 2, when this guest joined us, I feel like the word polyvagal has just been everywhere all of the time. I hear it in my sleep, right? And so, but what I find interesting about the information that today's guest went through in part 2 or in part 1 in episode 2, and is going to go through today is that language-oriented lens. I think that that gives such a unique perspective on the polyvagal-informed techniques. So we've got Bre Hirst here with us today. Welcome, Bre.
Thank you. Excited to be here again with you both.
Welcome back. So Bre is a LISW, a licensed independent social worker in the state of Iowa. She's also a LCSW, a licensed clinical social worker in the state of Illinois. She joins us from the Quad Cities, so she's right on the border of those 2 states, which makes it very handy to be dual licensed there. She has been working in mental health for over 5 years. She teaches courses at Blackhawk College and at St. Ambrose University. She's got a private practice called Wholehearted Connections, where she does work in association with Blue Tree Counseling and Consultation right there in the Quad Cities. Bre is highly focused on psychoeducation, not only helping her clients to understand this information, but also spreading this information to other clinicians to help them in their clinical work as well. So we're very, very excited to have Bre joining us here again for part 2 so that we can all learn together.
Wonderful. And like Julie said, we are finishing part 2. I don't know if finishing is the right word. I think we could probably have 100 episodes, Bre, but doing part 2, talking about polyvagal-informed and language-oriented lenses. And so today, Bre gets to speak with us about how she uniquely integrates research-based strategies to support her clients in understanding mental health and how those internal and external systems that clients are navigating interact and impact one another to create meaningful and sustainable change. So as you're listening to Bre's training today, there are 3 primary objectives that we will take out of today's training. The first of those is understanding system attunement and regulation using a polyvagal-informed lens and strategies. Second to that, we're going to learn how to strengthen processing skills and practices that support building emotional intelligence. And finally, Bre's going to help us understand how communication and compassion impact our ability to experience felt safety, connection, and regulation at any given moment. And these are some objectives that really get me curious and excited to see where this training takes us today, Bre. So we will let you take it away.
Wonderful. Thank you. All right. So Kind of like in the first podcast, everything is really connected. So I'm going to work my way through it as best I can, and we'll circle back as we kind of need to and naturally will need to. So language-oriented lens, what that really means to me and what I try to practice for myself and with the clients is being mindful to the language we're using. And when we revisit that mindfulness, right, it's just paying attention to the language we're using, right? And this really started for me with my own therapist when I came in one session and was like, I'm a hot mess, right? That's something we tend to say a lot in our culture, pretty normalized. And she looked at me as a fellow clinical social worker and said, are you a hot mess, or are you a human that has a lot going on right now? And I was like, oof, yeah, right? Like even just feeling that noticeable change in that language, right? And so since that point, I really kept coming back to that, like, wow, like what a profound, like just kind of immediate, like acknowledgement of how powerful that language could be and the messages we send ourselves, right? And how then we reflect on it, right? Because since then, I really haven't used that phrase of a hot mess. And I've even spoken up a little bit when friends use it, right? And tried it a little bit that way and seeing how things go. And what that kind of brings to then when we think of our polyvagal lens is that connectedness, right? When I'm a human that's got a lot going on versus a hot mess, that sends different messages to our brain. That might help me move from a mobilized or immobilized state to a more connected state because I'm acknowledging that connected piece that, like, no, I'm not a hot mess. Like, you're right. This is a lot going on. Anyone in this situation would feel as overwhelmed as I am right now. So then when I thought about the language aspect, I really started thinking about how we communicate with each other, right? Either as clinicians, as fellow humans, even this idea, that, we're a therapist in this setting, but then like that's the only time we use these skills per se or this language, and we're not using it to our other, family members, friends, whatever that might happen to be for us. And when I started to do that and talk with my husband more, we started to talk and be more clear about what language for us is helpful in certain situations and what language for us isn't so helpful in certain situations. And that has then had that reciprocal effect on the different nervous system states, right? Because we're having these conversations when we're connected, when we're both in our upstairs brain and we're, thinking well and making plans. So that way it lays the groundwork for when these things come up. We've already talked about it and we come into the situation a little bit differently than what we have done in the past. So then with that, it kind of led me to this coping strategies, right? I actually cringe at the word these days, to be honest. It's used a lot. And I think through reflection with others, why I think I'm at this point with it is because naturally coping means after the fact, right? We're coping with things. And at what point in time, even when I think of social workers and being strengths-based, solution-focused, do we then need to say, well, what's a thriving strategy and why aren't we really focused on thriving strategies then, right? Like if we're always focused on the after, that doesn't necessarily translate to how it helps us before, not always, not with that clarity, right, with what that means. And so that's when I really started to make the connection between language and how we talk to each other, and then our state of being, right? It's the same, even if we think of body language, right? If a young human or any human is upset and maybe sitting on the ground crying, if I walk over to them and cross my arms and stand over top of them and say, "Are you okay?" It's different than me getting on their level, sitting down, offering maybe a fidget or something with them and just being with them, right? Each of those is also messages of communication and how we talk to one another. So, and all of this is still really based on the polyvagal theory, like in how Deb Dana even presents it. She talks about how we get the incoming information and then how we process it is the story we put out. And in that story, then, is the language. And so, even when I think of kind of the basis of CBT, right, cognitive behavioral therapy, and that idea of reframing, maybe, right, the connections, that's when it really hit me that that is the goal of the unlearning and relearning of some of the languages. And it happens even in short periods of time. So since meeting with you guys, I've obviously still been practicing and reflecting on these things. And a couple notes I made even for myself through the introduction was instead of saying regulation now, I tend to gravitate more to body balance, because when I kept reflecting on the word regulation and why it still, I don't know, just still felt rigid to me. It still felt maybe like not quite the goal of what I was going for, right? And so when I switched that to balance, right? So it'd be a system, attunement, and balance. That is where we have more flow, right? It feels less rigid or less yes, no. It feels more like a continuum or a spectrum. And then the other one I've learned through listening to another book right now is even moving from language of research-based to research-informed. Because what in this book they talk about is, while things are great when they're research-based, that's still very particular to the humans in that study. And so when we change that language even ever so slightly to research-informed, that's when we can say, like, this is the research, it's informing me this way, just how I'm now kind of unlearning and relearning CBT and how that sits with me, right? As far as the cognitive behavioral, not so much in control of, but more just in connection with, right? Like when we're using certain language, like cognitively, right? Whether that's thinking or out loud or any of that, how then are we feeling when we're using that language physiologically?
Yeah, absolutely. I love these kind of these reframings, right? These reprocessings of these phrases that so I mean, when you said research based versus research informed, I was like, yes, because going through a doctoral program, Dr. Grote understands this as well. Nothing will make you question every piece of research you've ever based anything on, like going through writing your own thesis and doing your own research. Like it is like, wait, that study that I based like my entire career on, it's based on 3 people, right? Like it is unbelievable when we get it. So I love what you're saying about research informed, right? We take the fact that these 10 people did this in this situation and we use that to inform what's happening, but it's not the only piece of information that we're using to inform what we decide and our client decides is the right path going forward. So I think that is so, I like almost jumped out of my chair when you said that. I was so excited. And even our first objective, understand system attunement and regulation, and then being able to reframe that regulation piece with body balancing is just such a, like you said, fluid way of being able to self-accept and accept in others that we're sometimes we are here and sometimes we are here, and it doesn't say stay stagnant of I'm regulated or I'm not regulated, because sometimes I'm more regulated than other times. And it doesn't mean that I don't have regulation. I do. I'm just not as regulated maybe as I was yesterday or as I might be tomorrow. And so being able to have that spectrum in our language and just built into the language so that our body can process hearing that and saying it in a different way is so beautiful. Do you still use that term attunement when talking about attunement and body balancing?
I do, because to me, that attunement word, kind of like why I moved away from regulation too, is because there's some things that in life call for imbalance, right? Like when I think of weather, one of the books I listened to, called The Light Maker's Manifesto, they talk about the ebb and flow of nature, right? And how naturally things ebb and flow. And when I think about us, and sometimes we have crying spells, or sometimes we have those kind of whoa moments, and instead of saying we're in dysregulation, we're just out of balance for a moment, right? Like out of balance comes in all things, and in some situations calls for it, right? Like sometimes we are dysregulated because everything around us is happening, right? And then instead of saying, well, I need to regulate, well, maybe not, but how can we help balance you out right now? Because you're right. Like I wouldn't expect you to be regulated through all this hardship. So then the attunement comes in with the system, like the nervous system states, connected, mobilized, immobilized, because it's being attuned to what we need in each of those individual states. So like that's where the language comes in with my husband. So like for me, if I woke up one morning and said, oh, I think it's going to be a sad day today. He just says, all right, sounds good. Let me know what you need to get through to today. Right. And it might be a surprise Diet Pepsi at the end of the day or something. Right. So when we're more clear and have a more sense of our body, what we may be ebbing and flowing through, we can, when we're better attuned to it, we can then plan those thriving strategies, and we're not always coping then, right? We can put those things in place ahead of time when we're in our upstairs brain, in our connected nervous state, and it tends to go somewhat smoother, because then I have found that that's where we have the processing time to check our expectations, because that's another word, right, that we think of a lot when moving through the world, is we have a lot of expectations placed on us, some of our own, some of other people. And that's where, as a clinical social worker, I talk even with clients about the macro level kind of things impacting maybe their decision making or influence right now that they might not be considering in that way. So then when we're attuned with those external systems too, we can then find more connections between our internal system and our external systems, and kind of do those eco maps, right? Like what energy is coming in, what energy is going out, because we only have so much energy, and the idea that we can put 100% into everything is not possible, right? Like we literally are not robots, so it's not going to work in that way. And if we're putting 100% into the focus of maybe academic work, then by default, we're not putting focus into other places. And then it's accepting that, which is the other kind of language piece. I talk a lot about the language of punishment and consequences. A lot of people like to use those words interchangeably, and they are very different, as consequences is what happens after something. A punishment is what is added to that, right? And so when we use language in either thoughtless ways, where we're just not maybe aware of the impact of how language can impact, or we're on the other spectrum when we even hear the word manipulate, right? And we hear even a lot of adults say, kids are manipulative. Well, to me, right, we model what kids are doing, and by using using the language of consequence instead of punishment is also a sort of manipulation, right? Because that's not what that means. And so when we break down and process through intentionally what we're doing, what we're saying, the messages we might be portraying, that's where that reframing, that unlearning and relearning kind of comes into place.
Absolutely. I love all of that, right? And as I keep going back to thinking about, that reframe, like Julie was saying, of body balancing, right? And thinking about working with little kids, right? My brain goes to, okay, if you tell me to regulate, that's a really abstract concept, right? And I'm going, even as an adult, when I hear you say body balance, I do this like physical check, right? Of like, where am I at? Where's my body at this time? And it feels so much more obtainable to sort of go, okay, where's my body at? And when we think about those thriving strategies, right? I love that, of like, okay, if I'm way off balance, do I need another person to hold on to? Do I need an object, right? Do I need to just put my foot down? Like, and thinking about all of those ways. I love that concept of thriving versus coping, right? I don't need to be at 10% or less to recharge and cope. I can think about ways to thrive at 90% or 80%. And having that language to communicate that with others as well. And looking at sort of objective number 2, right? And thinking about, okay, how do we take this information and help strengthen those skills to kind of support that emotional intelligence development, to then be able to say, here's where I'm at, or here's this feeling and I'm off balance because. What are some ways that you have found to effectively increase that emotional intelligence work with the kids you work with?
Wonderful question. And it actually, it's both, like, I work with both kids and adults still. And like, even I think my youngest is more towards early elementary, and I'm in the high schools and then adults. So for me, it looks a few different ways. One, I also talk with students on kind of like how they see it playing out in the future. And what this helps with is teaching them how it can resonate with them differently, right? Because that's also what I feel like I observe a lot, is we're not really great at teaching kids like the forward thinking steps of like, we're at this step, but then here's how we plan to get to these next steps. So I talk with my high school students and middle school students even about how these thriving strategies, we talk a lot about burnout in our adult world. It's no different, right? And if we're always focused on coping strategies in our adult world as far as burnout, that is also then translating, right? Like, kids are also learning that then we have to be burnt out before we're doing things. So I teach them that this is how it goes moving forward, as right now we're working on structuring what it ideally would look like for you to move through the day. So, moving forward, what might be a good fit or not a good fit, right? If right now mornings are hard and we're struggling getting out of bed, maybe it's not that you're not good enough, right? Because you can't get to school on time. Maybe mornings are just not your thing. And when you are older and you can have more autonomy and find a second shift job, you'll thrive, right? And so it's letting them know those kind of different steps of how we can see things, right? Reframing that of, right, you might be late every day. I understand that based on this system's expectations, that's what it looks like. And if we detach from this system and implement a different one, this is how it might look different, right? So teaching them how that looks at those stages is helpful. And even younger than that, then too, is how they continue to get through school, right? The strategies are still more focused on, all right, you go to middle school next year. What's working well now? How can we problem solve and collaborate and see how that fits into a middle school strategy where we're now have, 3-minute passing periods and we have to worry about lockers and bathrooms and all of those things, right? So teaching them that way has also been super helpful for me. And the other thing that you might have noticed too is that I haven't really talked a lot about emotion-specific language, right? And what I have found is that in all of that language, and even in Brené Brown's book, Atlas of the Heart, she goes through all of the different types of experiences in this emotional language. And what I found myself thinking was that, wow, if these things are so abstract and so hard to conceptualize as adults, as researchers, like we can't even agree on what things are, then attaching anger to a body balance thing is really hard for me to do then, right? Because they're probably not angry, right? Like that's me in my nervous state attaching a language thing to them, right? And so if I'm no longer seeing the human next to me as angry and I see them as out of balance and maybe needing something to be more in balance, that also has a shift on my nervous system then too, right? I am still in connection. Whereas if I respond saying, oh my God, they're so angry, I can already feel it in my body, right? Even just pretending to say that. So those are the different ways. We also talk about boundaries and the language of how we word boundaries, which is really important too. What I found is that a lot of, like with many of our language things, we use them differently. And so I've really had to hone in with clients on what boundaries is and how we frame them, right? And so one that is kind of easy to kind of get our brains around is, like, in the adult world, we might say a boundary is you can't email me on the weekends. Well, it's not really a boundary. You don't really have a way to enforce that. And that's where that expectation gap comes in. So then instead, reframing that language to, I will not respond to emails on the weekend, right? That is what's in my influence, right? And I've even gravitated away from control and done influence, right? Because even in that essence, even if I think I have control of something, that might be a misconception. So when I tell myself I have influence over something, I'm acknowledging that mindfulness, like I'm doing what I can in this moment. I don't have full control over anything, including myself, right? I can't just, tell my, if I was having a heart attack and I said, stop having a heart attack, right? Like that's not how that works. Same with those other kind of physiological things. So influence instead of control has been another kind of reframe for me too. The other component is trust. When I think of like that system attunement and trust, right? A lot of messages I see in our culture is distrusting our own body, right? Like when I think of my 10-month-old and he's crying, and a lot of people's natural things is to say, you're okay, right? Well, no, literally he's crying, right? Like he's by nature telling us something's out of balance, right? Like he's not okay for some reason. And so even when I think of that language or calling him fussy, right? Like even from way back when we start associating language to those things, that's when I see it starting. So when we go to the doctor's office and he gets shots and he's, naturally out of balance after, I'm holding him, squeezing him, saying, I know it's hard. You were brave. You were safe, right? Because then that's the messages we're putting out. He's still hearing that language and hearing it through my body language, whether he understands it or not. And if I'm already telling him he's okay, when his body's telling him he's not okay, that's where we see in adulthoods where we don't have people connected to their own body. It can also look like in kids that all of a sudden have to go to the bathroom, right? Not being able to tell whether we're hungry or not, or when to stop eating. And then when we think of how that spirals into different things, we can think of eating disorder or eating patterns. I even tried to stay away from disorder right now, right? Because when I think of anxiety or other things labeled disordered, or even attention, like ADHD, is it a disorder or is my thinking perfectly in order for what's going around me, right? And as someone who identifies as ADHD and those other kind of neurodivergent kind of things, that's when I really started thinking, like, not really all that disordered. Like culture calls for me to have my mind on all of these different things right now. And again, that language, right? Is it disordered or is it adaptive? So it's challenging those kind of mindsets too, then.
Absolutely. My daughter came home yesterday from her first day in first grade, and she was so excited about so many things in this new, or in second grade, I'm sorry, and so many things in this new classroom. And one of them that I was also so excited about is that they don't have snack time. They have snack, and the snack is out on the desk as soon as they come into the classroom in the morning. Like it's there. Morning snack is just sitting there. And at any time between when the school starts and 10:30 or 11 or whatever the time is that it's last call for snack, they can go quietly, get their snack, bring it to their desk and eat it. Or they can go get their snack, put it on their desk and eat it later at any time in the morning. And I went, oh my gosh, this teacher is a genius. And she was so excited about the bathroom policy as well, because her teacher told all of them, she sat them all down and she said, you are second graders, you know when you need to use the restroom. So as long as I know that you're gone, so you move your little square so that I know when you're in the bathroom, and as long as you are responsible about doing that and about moving it back when you come in here, you go to the bathroom whenever you need to go to the bathroom. And I went, I'm so excited. I love this teacher, because we're told so often, even as adults, we're told you're wrong. This is when you are allowed to eat breakfast food. This is when you're allowed to eat food at all. This is when you're allowed to feel sad. This is when you're allowed to watch television. This is when you're allowed to be outside. I mean, it's all day long, even as adults. And so for all of us as humans, the ability to be able to say, no, I can sing when I feel like singing, right? I can dance down my stairs if I want to, right? And being able to say to my body over and over and build that trust that it is okay to do these things. And the safety piece that you were talking about comes in when there are boundaries on it. And so you talked about boundaries, you talked about consequences versus punishment versus discipline, right? So discipline means to teach, and consequences are not enforced by an outside force, another person. And so the example of the snack or the bathroom system that they've got going there, in order for that to work, that teacher has to have very firm boundaries about what she will do. And so she will clear out all the snacks that have not been eaten at that time. She will give one warning that it's last call for snack, and then she will get rid of those snacks and they cannot have the snack after that time. So those boundaries being communicated, being set there, and then for her to be following through on what she will do is so important. And if somebody does not eat their snack between the time that the snack is out and when the snack goes away, then it's easy sometimes as humans to slip into, well, that teacher is punishing me for not eating my snack when I was supposed to, when really that situation is a perfect outline of a natural consequence. If I don't eat the snack during the snack window, then I am going to be hungry later. And so even though it's more fun to do centers, or it's more fun to do whatever else I could be doing instead of eating that snack, then I'm going to be hungry later on if I don't. And so I'm more likely to eat the snack and not be mad at the teacher because I'm hungry.
And that is the problem solving process, right? Helping them realize those things, right? And so then in that next situation, that conversation might be, all right, last time we were out of balance because we didn't get our snack and it got thrown away and you were hoping for it for later. Do you want to put it on your desk now so that doesn't happen again, right? And then it's still that autonomy. It's building on those skills with that compassion, right? Because that's the other piece we haven't touched on yet. And Dr. Kristen Neff is who I've read as far as self-compassion goes. And she talks about both tender and fierce self-compassion. And in these situations, right, we have those modeling abilities as the more grown humans in those moments to say, yeah, I'd be upset too if someone took my sack, and I get it. And so next time, how can I help you remember, right? And then it's having that conversation of maybe that one warning wasn't enough. Can you come tap me on the shoulder so I have a different sensory input about it, right? Because if we bring back to those body things, not everyone is as auditorily attuned as others, right? And when we think of brain and body development, naturally at younger ages, we're not going to respond to those auditory cues as quickly as we might if someone comes around in front of us and actually gets our attention visually. And so it sounds like, and exactly what I try to practice too for this teacher, is it's about the process, right? It's about, here is the process and you have autonomy within the process, and so do I, right? And so that's where that flexibility and that ebb and flow comes in, because when it's less about power over and more about power with, that's where we see a lot of those relationship dynamics change too, in almost any relationship, right? Whether it's spouse, parent-child, teacher-student, any of those kind of relationship dynamics can feel different when we are more biased towards the collaborative approach, right? Because then if we challenge of how we use the word bias and even judgment, right? We like to say a lot of like, we're non-judgmental. Well, I'm not sure that that's the goal, right? Like we want people to make decisions. We want people to make critically thoughtful decisions. And while we might not want that to be based on certain things, and we can teach how, those blanket kind of sayings of be non-judgmental or even be positive or good vibes only, any of those kind of things kind of stop our thinking in that way. Well, positive vibes, that's not always possible and that's not always needed, right? If it was a funeral and you showed up and were like positive vibes only, like no, right? Like that's not authentic, right? And so then I talk to clients about, if I was to put something on a pillow, right? Like it would be authentic vibes, right? Like come as you are, right? Like that's what we're here for. The relationship building, the trust, the body balance, all of it is kind of that trial and error process mixed in with the psychoeducation. And so kind of as we've seen in part 1 and then in this part 2, that's kind of what it looks like in therapy sessions too for clients. It's starting a little bit with the body balance. And then once we have more of a sense of that body balance, it's more of this processing practices, right? Like these things are always going to happen rather than trying to squash them not happening or always just cope for them after. How can we embrace these situations differently? That's why I drive with balloon squishies, right? If I am having a crying spell, oftentimes it's on one of my longer drives. And so I have things in place, right? We talked about me spilling on myself all the time, right? Another thing, right? We just process through it. We have a different system for it and we move through our day because to me, those are the different thriving strategies. If I'm always just frustrated with myself, that's that lack of compassion then, right? So then that's where that practice piece of that compassion comes in, right? I'm not a messy human. I'm just a human that pays more attention to hurry up and eating than I do not spilling on myself. And so I'm just going to put my focus and energy into this over here rather than trying to be something I'm not, right? So then I talk to clients, and one of the more latter things we start to build on then is that values, right? What values are we having for ourselves? A lot of times in the world, we like to talk about our personal and professional selves. I don't ascribe to that because of seeing myself as one human and this body balance, right? Because if I'm saying like I'm professionally this and personally this, what happens if things are so overwhelming in my personal life that they start to, carry over, which we know happens because we're not two different humans, right? And so then it's really solidifying, I am Bre. My big 2 values are authenticity and community. And that is what I try to make bigger decisions on when I'm making big decisions. That's when I'm talking with people, the language I'm using. If I felt something weird, I'm like, I don't like it. Same with the, even since we met last with replacing and reframing regulation and other. So it's like, and it's teaching clients that too, that like, I'm still doing this, right? Like, this is me still doing this. I still go see my therapist to do this, right? And modeling for them that it's not necessarily this like thing that just magically happens and all of a sudden we're all regulated and well and everything's good to go, right? Like it's this embracing this roller coaster ebb and flow as best we can, as prepared as we can be.
Yeah, I keep going back right to that thriving language, and I love the example you gave of, look, I know when I might be most likely to have an experience where I need a thriving skill in the car, right? And thinking about how that can impact our clients. And I'm with you, right? When I think about coping skills, I'm like, right? Like, what this word is. It reminds me of self-care, right? Like we've used it to the point that it's lost its meaning. But I would talk to kids about what kind of strategies can they have in different environments, right? What we need in the car is different maybe than what we have access to at home or at school. And so I love those examples of, okay, where may I need to thrive and how can I plan for that? And I keep going back, Bre, to that example you gave, right, about telling kids and adults, right, oh, you're okay. And I'm not, right? My own 7-year-old broke her foot last year playing soccer, and her immediate reaction was like, I'm fine, right? Like she was adamant she was fine because that was the expectation. And it was like, but you're not. And really kind of giving that language to our clients to be able to trust their own bodies, right? Like you said, I think there's been so much override of, maybe I am fine. Maybe it doesn't hurt. Maybe I don't need to go to the bathroom. Maybe I'm not hungry. Being able to reestablish that trust with themselves by what they're being given in therapy and what we're modeling for them. And so thinking about ways to build that connection and that regulation in those moments has really stood out to me as you're talking today. And thinking about values, right? I immediately was like, oh, I want to take that as a counseling prompt, right? Like, what are your values as a human? And identifying that while we may have different responsibilities at work and at home, we're bringing those same values and that same piece of us to those situations and learning to
clarifying, right? Our roles and responsibilities versus our values, right? Our personal roles and responsibilities versus our professional roles and responsibilities. The other thing too with the trust, so Brené Brown talks about trust as a marble jar, and that we can put marbles in the jar as kind of a way to visualize it. She talks about that in a few of her books. I've kind of adapted it a little because for some reason that felt very like clean and rigid, right? Like putting one marble jar and everything's the same. I don't know. It felt too clean for me in that moment. So what I kind of did is I made my own trust jar, and it has perler beads and rubber bands and push pins and paper clips. And I kind of adopted the idea that earning trust both in myself and from other people isn't always this specific kind of thing, right? Like sometimes earning trust is someone being super flexible with us. Sometimes earning trust is someone doing something pokey on our behalf, right? And like standing up for us maybe, right? Or us doing that for ourselves. When I think of the self-compassion and Kristen Neff breaking it down into tender and fierce, right? To me, then when I took that with the marble jar kind of idea, I was like, well, I don't think that they're both the same type of thing, right? When I think of putting something in this jar as far as trust, a more tender might be more of the perler beads or the rubber band, and the more fierce might be the pokey or the paper clip, right? And so helping clients kind of visualize that trust in themselves, and that like, no, sometimes trust means yelling and saying no, or yelling and saying I'm not okay, or choosing punishment over obedience, right? Like those are some of the things then helping the adult realize on the other end of those conversations of kids might choose the punishment or the disobedience, right? Like we're not in their nervous system state. We're not in their brain. We don't know what's going through their brain and body at the moment. And if we're assuming then that maybe it's just pure disobedience, maybe it's not, right? Maybe they're fearful. Maybe they didn't sleep well last night. Maybe something awful happened at home that morning before they went to school, right? So it's then helping, right, that relationship conversation between those dynamics too. So that kind of ties like the relationship and communication in with the trust and the boundaries, right? And then I often talk with clients that it's not that relationships don't have rupture, right? All relationships have rupture. It's the repair work, right? It's the how we come back around to, you know what, I'm not sure that felt so great. Like, how can we maybe do it different next time? Like, here's what the story I'm telling myself about this. Like, what are you telling yourself? And knowing when is the time to do those things, right? If we're in a mobilized or immobilized state, that's not the time to do those things. However, based on how our systems are set up right now in the educational world and other, that's often what we have. And so it's then compounding, right? That idea of like, we're not teaching people to trust themselves either. The forced apologies, all of that kind of plays in then to this when we our clinicians, right? And talking to people about trauma and all of those other experiences in life that then kind of reinforce these thinkings.
Yeah. And I like what you said about values, having our own values, but not allowing our choices that go along with our own values to be morally judged through language, right? So, like, I loved the example of if I have a hard time waking up in the morning, right? And then I go to school and my teacher says, put your backpack on the hook. And I'm like, no, I'm not going to, right? And I might know that there's a punishment, which is go to the principal's office, but I might really need to not be around 20 kids right now. And so I might go, I know exactly what that punishment is, but I need to be alone with maybe just one adult that I trust, which is the principal. I'm going to choose that. And so there is no way you're getting me to put that backpack on the hook, right? So, but what happens so often in language, and it goes back to the relationship piece about you talking with your partner about what is helpful language there and what is not helpful language there. Because in that situation of something terrible happened at home that morning, my father moved out this morning, right? And then I go to school and I need to not be around 20 kids. And the language that might come at me in that situation as an 8-year-old or 7-year-old is, you are disrespectful. You are non-cooperative. You are not being a team player in this classroom. You don't care about your fellow students. Right? And so these are all very personal labels, and they have a moral component. Now we're putting moral judgment through our language on a behavior of not picking up a backpack and putting it on, right? Or if I'm late to school because I'm a night owl and I get a lot done at night, but mornings, I don't, my brain just doesn't turn on until 10 o'clock in the morning, right? If I'm that way, I might hear words that say, you are lazy, you are not punctual, you don't care about taking responsibility for yourself. Those are very strong identifying messages that we're hearing, versus being the adult as the therapist that says to somebody, you are really productive at night, right? You have the most spoons at night. You have the most energy at night. Your body, literally, your blood pumps better at night, right? And your neurons fire faster at night. You are that person, which then, because there's a boundary on how much energy any given person has in any 24-hour period, there is a limit. That limit might be different from one day to the next, but every single day has a limit. And so in that regard, we can say, well, yeah, you are very functional from the hours of 12 p.m. or 12 a.m. to 3 a.m., which means necessarily you're not as functional from the period of 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. It is necessary. It makes sense that you're not as productive during those times. And as soon as it makes sense, we can have that empathy for other people and the specific challenge that they might be experiencing, which is that school starts at 7:45. Why does school start at 7:45? Right? So that's a specific challenge that is challenging for that person because they've got such great energy output from at other times. And so then we say, oh, well, of course, that's what's happening. Of course, it's a challenge. And it builds the relationship because in the example we were talking about with the teacher and the student, where the student is hungry after the snack period has closed, being able to say, oh yeah, that snack is from 8 to 11 and you can bring it to your desk and eat it later. You can do all these things. It allows me as the teacher, as the caring adult, to say, what are we going to do against this horrible thing of you being hungry at 11:30? Like, I don't want that for you. You don't want that for you. That's not comfortable. Nobody wants to be hungry. What can we do? And so now there's connection of, yeah, maybe you don't hear me when I'm doing that because you're so focused. Your focus is awesome. You get focused into something, you are finishing that thing. It doesn't matter who's saying what, right? So yeah, maybe I do tap you on the shoulder, maybe I do something else, but it goes back to what you were talking about, building that relationship with your partner, where you say, oh, this is helpful to me to hear, and this is not helpful for me to hear. My partner says things to me. Colleen knows my partner. My partner says things to me sometimes that are extremely helpful to me. And other people hearing it on the street would be like, what is wrong with that person? Right? Because I'll get into like, I can't do anything. I'm horrible at everything, especially when I'm tired. Right? So I'll get into that. And he's like, yeah, like you're pretty bad at a lot of stuff. Right? And then he'll start talking about things I'm bad at, like putting together boxes or playing Tetris. And immediately my brain is like, oh no, you did not. Right? I'm great at a lot of things. And every single time consistently is helpful because we've had those conversations, because in the relationship. And so, yeah, no, would I recommend that any person without knowing their situation say that to your partner? Be like, yeah, you are pretty terrible. Right? I wouldn't, but it works for our relationship because we've had those conversations and that understanding about how we communicate.
I love that. I think what kind of my ending kind of thing is when I talk with clients too, especially for those that we've been meeting for a while. Like I even have a high school student where they presented kind of like, what do you think I should do? And then immediately after asking said, I know there's no right or wrong answer. I wish you would just tell me your thoughts. Like she knew like what I was already going to say, right? Because we worked through that process of, I can tell you my thoughts, but like there's no right or wrong to any of this. Like we just need to do with what feels within our influence and balance right now. And so I think it's telling, right? When we talk about relationships and when we can kind of remove ourselves from like that punishment reward a little bit and just go with that connection, that process, like what is our process to just get through it rather than trying to put this behavior behind us or, do all of this stuff. When it's about the process, then that's where that autonomy comes in, that trust in their own body. Does that make it harder sometimes for relationships? Absolutely. And what I try to convey is that that's no different from a parent-child than a spouse or other friendships, right? Because if we're modeling a power over relationship, whether that be parent, child, teacher, student, that's what we're modeling as a relationship style. So if we instead model collaboration, right? The language of we instead of the you and I's of the statement world, that's where that process then changes too within us, right? We're in that connection mode and we can recognize when other people might not be in that connection mode.
I love that. Absolutely. We're wanting that connection sometimes, but oh my gosh, the other person has to be ready for that as well in that moment. So I think that's so important to recognize too. So
can I share one more quick story real quick?
Yes, please.
So I also had a kiddo that I hadn't seen in a very long time, just between summer colds and other things. And we were trying to end session and he dumped the Legos everywhere and then kept pushing them around saying, I'm going to make this more challenging. And all I kept thinking of, yep, we haven't spent a lot of time together, right? Like this is our version of like, hey, you haven't seen me in a long time. You're not leaving yet. Like I want at least a few more minutes of pushing these Legos around and us being together. And then as soon as I got like the Legos in the bag and waiting for him to put the last one in through our sequence of normal transitioning out of session kind of language, he put the person in and we walked back to class. And so it's again, those like when I see it differently, right? When he's not disobedient, when he's not following directions, right? Like, no, he's just wants a few extra minutes because I haven't seen him in a while. Like that makes sense to me, right? Even when I think of going to see my own therapist, right? We start a whole new thing at the end of the first few minutes or towards the end, right? Like it's that same thing. Like, oh wait, just kidding. I want to keep talking. So that
Absolutely.
was I'd love to share.
I love that, because when we're in relationship with the person, then we can read, we can hear, we can interpret that nonverbal communication, and we can respond verbally with the response to what they're actually saying to us. So being able to say, yeah, I missed you too, right? And then instead of pick up those blocks, we can say, gosh, I enjoyed this also. Wasn't this a great session? This was so fun. And so being able to respond verbally and model that in a way that they know, okay, they hear what I'm saying by throwing these Legos around is just awesome. So, gosh, I feel like we could do, like Colleen said, 10 more episodes. So Bre, we would love to have you back again for another training. I have like pages and pages of things I want to ask you about and hear more about from you. So Bre, we would love to do that. And thank you so much for part 2 here today. We're looking forward to seeing you in part 3.
Yeah, absolutely, Bre. It's been wonderful to have you here. And I just was thinking about that last part. Like Julie said, we could talk forever, but your ability to hear what your client was showing you, I think about how long that session would have lasted, right? If you went into all of those kind of negative connotations we were talking about earlier, right? You're being disrespectful, you're being defiant, like the struggle that would have ensued, and how long you would have been then trying to get that client back to class and the emotional state they would have returned to wherever they were going in. And like Julie said, your ability to really see that behavior for what it was and meet them where they're at, allowed for that body balance, I imagine, between both of you, right? So thank you so much.
If I go in that hole of defiant, I feel it, right? As a clinician, as a fellow human. Yep. So absolutely.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Bre. It's been an honor having you back with us. Again, join us anytime. You've got some busy stuff coming up as well. You've got the Psychosocial Oncology Professionals Symposium, better known hopefully as POPS, right? Coming up in October of this year. So we are, I can't wait to hear how that goes for you. And I know you've got some really great presentation stuff for that. And if anybody is looking for more from Bre or interested in services with Bre, you can find her at Blue Tree Counseling. Their website is bluetreecounseling.org, and all of her contact information and ways to get connected is there. So please check that out. All of the references that were mentioned will be in our show notes for today. So if you heard something and I want to check out more, I want to read that, those will all be linked for you there. We appreciate all of you for listening, and don't forget that you need a training.
Thank you so much for joining us today on You Need a Training. We encourage you to share this episode with anyone you think may be interested in learning more about mental health techniques and interventions. Also, make sure to follow us on Facebook and Instagram to stay up to date with all upcoming training opportunities. And don't forget to listen to our other podcast, You Need a Counselor, where we talk with individuals around the world about their counseling experiences. Heart & Solutions is proud to provide CE-eligible trainings for our counseling community. This training may be eligible for continuing education credit hours through either the National Board for Certified Counselors, provider number 7376, or the Association of Play Therapy, provider number 21-645. To obtain CE hours for today's training, be sure to follow the steps in the description below.